So we're going to get started. Here we go with chapter 11. And today I'll read chapters 11 and 12. So here we see the two boys. I'm guessing these are Harvey and Wendell, but I don't know. Let's see. Chapter 11, Turnabout. Neither Lulu nor Wendell were around the following day. Mrs. Griffin said she'd seen them both before breakfast, and they disappeared. So Harvey was left to his own devices. He tried not to think about what happened the night before, but he couldn't help himself. Snatches of conversation kept coming back, and he puzzled over them all day. What had Jive meant, for instance, when he told Harvey that turning him into a vampire was not so much a game as an education? What kind of lesson had he learned by jumping off a roof and scaring Wendell? And all that stuff about soul stealers and how they had to be served. What had that meant? Was it Mr. Hood that Jive had been speaking of? That great power they all had to serve? If Hood was somewhere in the house, why hadn't anyone, Lulu, Wendell, or himself, encountered him? Harvey had quizzed his friends about Hood and had the same story from them both. They'd heard no footfalls, no whispers, no laughter. If Mr. Hood was indeed here, where was he hiding, and why? So many questions, so few answers. And then, as if these mysteries weren't enough, another came along to vex him. In the late afternoon, lounging in the shade of the treehouse, he heard a yell of frustration and peered through the leaves to see Wendell racing across the lawn. He was dressed in an anorak and boots, even though it was sweltering hot, and he was stomping around like a madman. Harvey shouted to him, but his call went either unheard or ignored, so he climbed down and pursued Wendell around the side of the house. He found him in the orchard, red-faced and sweaty. "What's going on?" he said. "I can't get out," Wendell said, grinding a half-rotted apple underfoot. "I want to leave, Harvey, but there's no way out." "Of course there is. I've been trying for hours and hours, and I tell you, the mist keeps sending me back the way I came." "Hey, calm down. I want to go home, Harvey," Wendell said, close to tears now. "Last night was too much for me. That thing came after my blood. I know you don't believe me." "I do," said Harvey. "Honest, I do." "You do?" "Certainly." "Well, then maybe you should leave too. Because if I go, it'll come after you." "I don't think so," said Harvey. "I've been kidding myself about this place," Wendell said. "It's dangerous." "Oh yeah, I know it seems like everything's perfect, but..." Harvey interrupted him. "Maybe you should keep your voice down," he said. "We should talk about this quietly, in private." "Like where?" said Wendell, wild-eyed. "The whole place is watching us and listening to us. Don't you feel it?" "Why would it do that?" "I don't know," Wendell snapped. "But last night I thought, if I don't leave here, I'm going to die. I'll just disappear one night, or go crazy like Lulu." He dropped his voice to a whisper. "We're not the first, you know." "What about all the clothes upstairs? All the coats and shoes and hats? They belong to kids like us." Harvey shuddered. Had he played trick-or-treat in a murdered boy's shoes? "I want to get out of here," Wendell said, tears running down his face. "But there's no way out." "If there's a way in, there must be a way out," Harvey reasoned. "We'll go to the wall." With that, he marched off, Wendell in tow, round to the front of the house and down the gentle slope of the lawn. The mist wall looked perfectly harmless as they approached it. "Be careful," Wendell warned. It's got some tricks up its sleeve." Harvey slowed his step, expecting the wall to twitch or even reach for him, but it did nothing. Bolder now, he strode into the mist, fully expecting to emerge on the other side. But by some trick or other, he was turned around without even being aware of it, and delivered out of the wall with the house in front of him. "What happened?" he said to himself, puzzled. He stepped back into the mist. The same thing occurred. In he went, and out he came again, facing the opposite direction. He tried again, and again, and again, but the same trick was worked upon him every time, until Harvey was as frustrated as Wendell had been half an hour before. "Now do you believe me?" Wendell said. "Yes. So what do we do?" "Well, we don't yell about it," Harvey whispered. "We just get on with the day, pretend we've given up leaving. I'm going to do a little looking around." He began his investigations as soon as they got back into the house, by going in search of Lulu. Her bedroom door was closed. He knocked, then called her. There was no reply, so he tried the handle, and the door was unlocked. "Lulu?" he called. "It's Harvey." She wasn't there, but he was relieved to see that her bed had been slept in, and that she'd apparently been playing with her pets recently. The doors to the doll's house were open, and the lizards were everywhere underfoot. There was one strangeness, however. The sound of running water led him to the bathroom, where he found the bath full almost to brimming, and Lulu's clothes scattered in the puddles on the tile. "Have you seen Lulu?" he asked Mrs. Griffin when he got downstairs. "Not in the last few hours," she replied, "but she's been keeping to herself." Mrs. Griffin looked hard at Harvey. "I wouldn't pay too much attention if I were you, child," she said. "Mr. Hood doesn't like inquisitive guests." "I was only wondering where she'd got to," Harvey said. Mrs. Griffin frowned, her tongue working against her pale cheek as though it wanted to speak, but didn't dare. "Anyway," Harvey went on, deliberately goading Mrs. Griffin, "I don't believe Mr. Hood exists." "Now you be careful," she said, her voice and frown deepening. "You don't want to talk about Mr. Hood that way." "I've been here days and days," Harvey said, realizing as he spoke that he lost count of his time in the house, "and I haven't seen him once. Where is he?" Now Mrs. Griffin came at Harvey with her hands raised, and for a moment he thought she was going to strike him, but instead she took his shoulders and shook him. "Please, child," she said, "be content with what you know. You're here to enjoy yourself for a little time. And child, it's such a little time. It flies by. Oh Lord, how it flies." "It's just a few weeks," Harvey said. "I'm not going to stay here forever." Now it was he who stared at her. "Or am I?" he asked. "Stop," she told him. "You think I am here forever, don't you?" he said, shaking off her grip. "What is this place, Mrs. Griffin? Is it some kind of prison?" She shook her head. "Don't tell me lies," he said. "It's stupid. We're locked up in here, aren't we?" Now, though she was shaking with fear from head to foot, she dared to make a tiny nod of her head. "All of us?" he said. Again she nodded. "You too?" "Yes," she whispered. "Me too, and there's no way out. Believe me, if you try to escape again, Karna will come after you." "Karna?" he said, remembering the name from the conversation between Jibe and Mar. "He's up there," Mrs. Griffin said, "on the roof. That's where the four of them live. Rictus, Mar, Karna, and Jibe, you know. I've met all except Karna." "Pray you never do," said Mrs. Griffin. "Now listen to me, Harvey. I've seen many children come and go through this house, some of them foolish, some of them selfish, some sweet, some brave, but you're one of the brightest souls I've ever set eyes on. I want you to take what joy you can from being here. Use the hours well, because there will be fewer than you think." Harvey listened patiently to this. Then, when she'd finished, he said, "I still want to meet Mr. Hood." "Mr. Hood is dead," Mrs. Griffin said, exasperated by his persistence. "Dead? You swear?" "I swear," she replied. "On the grave of my poor Clue-Cat, I swear. Mr. Hood is dead, so don't ask about him ever again." This was the first time Mrs. Griffin had ever come close to giving Harvey an order, and though he wanted to press her further, he decided not to. Instead, he said he was sorry for bringing up the subject and wouldn't do it again. Then he left her to her secret sorrows. Okay, so now we know that they're all stuck inside the house. Okay, here's a picture of, looks like a lizard person. Maybe that's Lulu. I don't know. She has the pet lizards. She's missing. Maybe they turned her into one of these things. Chapter 12. What the Flood Gave Up and What It Took. "Well," said Wendell, when Harvey came to his room, "what's the story?" Harvey shrugged. "Everything's fine," he said. "Why don't we just enjoy ourselves while we can?" "Enjoy ourselves?" Wendell said. "How can we enjoy ourselves when we're locked in?" "It's better in here than it is out in the world," Harvey said. Wendell looked at him in astonishment. "That's true, isn't it?" As he spoke, he grabbed hold of Wendell's hand, and Wendell realized there was a ball of paper in Harvey's palm, which he was trying to pass between the two of them. "Maybe you should just find a quiet little corner and do some reading," he said, glancing down at their hands as he spoke. Wendell got the idea. He claimed the balled-up note from Harvey's hand and said, "Maybe I'll do that." "Good," said Harvey. I'm going to go out and enjoy the sun while I can." That was exactly what he did. He had a lot of planning to do before midnight, which was when the note told Wendell they should meet to make their escape. Surely, even the forces that guarded the house had to sleep sometimes. The business of keeping the seasons rolling around couldn't be easy. And of all the hours to slip away, midnight seemed the most promising. But he didn't suppose it would be easy. The house had been a trap for decades, perhaps centuries. Who knew how old its evil really was? Even at midnight, it would not be so foolish as to leave the exit wide open. They would have to be quick and clever, and not panic or lose their tempers once they were in the mist. The real world was out there somewhere. All they had to do was find it. He knew when he saw Wendell for Halloween that the note had been read and understood. There was a look in Wendell's eyes that said, "I'm ready. I'm nervous, but I'm ready." The rest of the evening passed for the two of them like the performance of a strange play in which they were actors, and the house, or whoever haunted it, was the audience. They went about enjoying themselves as though this was a night like any other, heading out to play trick or treat with a show of loud laughter, even though they were both shuddering in their borrowed shoes. Then coming in to eat their supper and spend what they hoped would be their last Christmas in the house. They opened their presents: a mechanical dog for Wendell, a magician's kit for Harvey, said their good nights to Mrs. Griffin. Goodbye, of course, not good night, but Harvey didn't dare let her know, and then went to bed. The house grew quiet, and quieter still. The snow no longer sighed at the sill, nor the wind at the chimney. It was, Harvey thought, the deepest silence he'd ever heard. So deep that he could hear his heart beat in his ears, and every rustle of his body against the sheets sounded like a roll of drums. Here we are. A little before midnight, he got up and dressed, moving slowly and carefully so as to make as little noise as possible. Then he headed out to the passageway and, slipping like a thief from shadow to shadow, hurried down the stairs and out into the night. He left not by the front door, it was heavy and creaked loudly, but by the kitchen door, which brought him out to the side of the house. Though the wind had dropped, the air was still bitter and the surface of the snow had frozen. It crackled as he walked, however lightly he trod, but he was beginning to hope that the eyes and ears of the house were indeed closed at this hour. If not, why hadn't he been challenged? And he might make it to the perimeter without attracting attention. Just as he was about to turn the corner, however, that sweet hope was soured, as somebody in the murk behind him called his name. He froze in his tracks, hoping the darkness would conceal him. But the voice came again and again called his name. It was not a voice he recognized. Not Wendell, certainly not Mrs. Griffin, not Jive, not Rictus, not Mar. This was a frail voice, the voice of somebody who barely knew how to shape the syllables of his name. Harvey. And then all of a sudden he knew the voice, and his heart, which had been working overtime since he slipped out of bed, grew so loud in his ears it almost drowned out the summons when it came again. "Lulu?" he murmured. "Yes," said the voice. "Where are you?" "Near," she said. He stared at the thicket, hoping for some glimpse of her, but all he could see was the starlight glittering on the frosted leaves. "You're leaving," she said, her words slurred. "Yes," he whispered, "and you have to come with us." He took a step towards her, and as he did so, some of the glitter that he thought was frost retreated from him. What was she wearing that shimmered this way? "Don't be afraid," he said. I don't want you to look at me," she said. "What's wrong?" "Please," she said, "just keep your distance." She retreated even further from him and seemed to lose her balance as she did so. She dropped to the ground, the thicket around her shaking. Harvey stepped forward to help her up, but she let out such a sob that he stopped in his tracks. "I only want to help," he said. "You can't help me," she replied, every word pain. "It's too late. You just have to go while you still can. I just wanted to give you something to remember me by." He saw her move in the shadows, reaching out in his direction. "Look away," she said. He turned his head away from her. "Now close your eyes and promise you won't open them." He dutifully closed his eyes. "I promise," he said. And now he heard her moving towards him, her breath laborious. "Open your hand," she said. Her voice was near now. He knew if he opened his eyes, he'd be face to face with her, but he had made a promise and was determined to keep it. He put out his hand and felt first one, then two, then three heavy little objects, cold and wet, dropped into his cupped palm. "This was all I could find," Lulu said. "I'm sorry. Can I look?" he asked. "Not yet. Let me leave first." He closed his fingers around the gifts she'd given him, trying to make sense of them by touch. What were they? Pieces of frozen stone? No, they were carved. He could feel the grooves on one, a head on another, and now, of course, he knew what he held. 3 survivors of his ark, dredged up from the depths of the lake. The answer was no comfort to him, quite the reverse. He shuddered as he put the puzzle of Lulu's silvery gleam together with the knowledge of what he held. She had swum down to the bottom of the lake to recover these figures, a descent that was beyond the capacity of any land dweller. No wonder she'd retreat into the shadows, ordering him not to look at her. She wasn't human any longer. She was becoming, or had already become, a sister to the strange fish that circled in these dark waters, cold-blooded and silver-skinned. "Oh, Lulu," he said, "how did this happen?" "Don't waste your time with me," she murmured. "Just go while you have a chance." "I want to help," he said. "You can't," came the reply. "Can't help me. I've been here too long. My life is over." "That's not true," Harvey said. "We're the same age." "But I've been here so long I don't even remember." Her voice trailed away. "Don't remember what?" "Maybe I just don't want to remember," she said. "It'll hurt too much." She made a long, choked sigh. "You have to go," she said in a whisper. "Go while you still can." "I'm not afraid." "Then you're stupid," she said, "because you should be." He heard the thicket shake as she started to retreat from him. "Wait," he said. She made no reply. "Lulu!" The din of her departure grew louder. By the sound of it, she was almost throwing herself out of his range, breaking his promise. He opened his eyes and caught a glimpse of her as she fled. A shadow in the shadows, no more. He started after her, not knowing what he would say or do when he caught up with her, but knowing he'd never forgive himself if he didn't somehow help. Maybe if he persuaded her to go with him, out of the shadow of the house, its vicious magic would be undone. Or maybe he could find some doctor for her in the outside world who could cure her of this malformation. Anything rather than leaving her to return to the lake. Its waters were now in view, gleaming darkly between the branches of the thicket. Lulu had reached the bank, and for a moment, the meager starlight found her. All that Harvey had feared was true, and more. A fin grew from her bent and scaly back, and her legs had almost fused together. Her arms had become short and stubby, her fingers webbed. But it was her face, glimpsed as she turned back to look at him, that was the greatest shock. Her hair had fallen out, and her nose disappeared. Her mouth had lost its lips, and her blue eyes turned to swiveling silver balls, lidless and lashless. And yet, despite her freakishness, there was a human feeling in those eyes, and on that mouth a terrible sadness that he knew would never leave his heart if he lived to be 1,000. "You were my friend," she said, as she teetered on the bank. "Thank you for that." Then she stumbled into the water. He went to the edge of the lake at a dash, but by the time he reached the place from which she dived, the ripples were disappearing and the bubbles breaking. He watched the icy waters for a minute or more, hoping she would see him and surface. But she'd gone where he couldn't follow, and that, it seemed, was the end of it. Clutching her gifts to him like talismans, he trudged away from the lake and down the lawn to keep his rendezvous with Wendell. Okay, and here we have a giraffe and someone else. And another scary picture. And on Monday, we will start with chapter 13.